18th Cardiff. Thank you for coming to the 18th Cardiff Japanese online lecture series, exploring socio-cultural aspects of Japanese language learning. We also would like to say thank you for the Japan Foundation London to supporting this lecture series. The Cardiff Japanese lecture series aims to share contemporary insight and foster broader understanding of Japanese society's diverse cultural context. We explore socio-cultural aspects of Japanese language and culture for learners, teachers, and researchers interested in Japan. The 18th Cardiff Japanese Lecture Series today welcomes Dr. Toby Slade, a distinguished researcher from the UTS, Imagining Fashion Features Love. Dr. Slade is a leading expert in Japanese fashion and popular culture, whose work has significantly shaped our understanding of Japan's evolving fashion landscape and cultural expressions. Today's lecture will explore the fascinating phenomenon of Kawaii aesthetics in Japanese culture and its role as both social expression and subtle resistance in Japanese society. During the talk, please feel free to submit questions using the Q&A function. Please type your question in the Q&A box and we'll review them after the lecture finishes. And you can also upvote other audience questions to help us prioritize. And keep in mind that we may not have time to answer every question. And also in the webinar, all your microphones will be muted, and this webinar is being recorded, and the recorded session video will be in the Cardiff Japanese Online Lecture Series YouTube channel. And we will be putting a link to you in the chat box later. And okay, so let me briefly introduce today's lecturer, Toby Slade. Could you hold a sec? So, one sec. This is a profile of Toby. Toby is a fashion researcher. One sec. Fashion researcher in the UTS, Imagining Fashion Features Love, and authority on Japanese fashion and popular culture. His current research focuses on the history, contemporary forms, and changing meaning of luxury in Japan, revealing shifting definitions of social value and patterns of consumption throughout history. Toby joined UTS after more than 16 years at the University of Tokyo and Bunka Gakuen University in Japan. He is the author of 2 books. Japanese Fashion, A Cultural History, Berg 2009, was the first English language book to explore the entire historical sweep of fashion and clothing in Japan, with a particular emphasis on the modernity of Japanese clothing and its implications for contemporary theories of fashion. This work cemented Toby's reputation as an authority on Japanese fashion history. Book introducing Japanese popular culture, Rootred 2018, looks at fashion as a central component of popular culture. And hello, Toby.
Hello. Hello.
Hello. Thank you for coming today.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, I'm so excited to learn from you today. So, and I'm going to stop sharing my slide now. So when you're ready, and you can start sharing your slide, and then you can start your lecture.
Okay, thank you very much.
No problem.
I'll start sharing now. Can everyone see that? That's all right. All right, lovely. Today I wanted to talk to you about Kawaii, and this talk is sort of going to be about, firstly, what it actually is scientifically and aesthetically. Where did it come from culturally in Japan? And then the story of how it came to be one of the dominant modalities in Japanese fashion and other aesthetic judgments. And then I'm going to explore a little bit what are the politics of Kawaii, and is this dominant Kawaii aesthetic a positive or negative phenomenon, especially for women and for the Japanese feminist project. So to sort of explain to people what it is, sometimes I use the contrast between K-pop and J-pop. And when you look at these 2 different types of of popular music, it becomes very clear that the Korean aesthetic is all about an icy perfection, very highly produced sound, and almost a sense of awe and the sublime. If you look closely at J-pop, however, it's very different. In fact, it almost emphasizes the imperfection. Um, uh, it has an accessibility and a cheerfulness that's just simply not in the Korean example. It's the same for boys groups as well, between K-pop and J-pop. I also just wanted to sort of talk about how I first discovered or how I first encountered the omnipresence of kawaii and cuteness in Japan. This is actually me when I first went to study at university, and some of my friends. And these women were all at university. They were all sort of over 20. They could vote. They all lived by themselves. It was a university town. They mostly had boyfriends. They were sort of in every possible way you could imagine. They were mature, adults, and yet the way they styled themselves was sort of as much younger, sort of prepubescent girls. And so I would often ask them, well, why are you presenting yourself in this way? And they often simply had no idea they were doing it. They just thought cuteness was the aesthetic they should adhere to. And I'm sort of reminded, as you can see from that quote at the bottom, that fish did not discover water. They didn't even know there was sort of a difference. It was sort of they were living in this world of cute. They didn't even know they were living in it. So what is cuteness? Well, there's sort of quite a bit of biological research on what cuteness is as a scientific phenomenon. As early as 1949, the ethnologist Konrad Lorenz showed that certain infantile features, big heads, stubby bodies, doughy eyes, clumsy movements, trigger feelings of care, of caring in us. And we know that because if we see a kitten and it's sort of cute, big eyes, a bit clumsy, we immediately feel that, oh, I've got to look after it. I've got to pick it up. It's so cute. It's something that goes off in our mind. And what's interesting, I guess, about this is that it's cross species. We're not just inspired by this to look after children, human children, but the whole idea of having pets, I guess, also is that this cuteness works, and we are inspired to look after cute things across other species. Konrad Lorenz sort of was looking at the way that birds imprint on their parents, and also how birds that sort of lay eggs in other nests can inspire and perhaps use as an evolutionary strategy other birds to take care of their and feed their children. Some of this research goes even further and says that because a lot of species have this sort of mechanism to look after the young in their species, we have and other animals have evolved to be cuter, because the cuter you are, the longer you're sort of taken care of by adults or your parents. And so they think that particularly for some species, these are sort of magpies in my garden in Australia, the young will pretend to be young for longer than they actually are to inspire their parents to feed them. And the same with humans. Barry Bogan showed that there is a sort of a way in which our bodies remain smaller even when our brains reach adult size, and when we have sort of a whole lot of other things in place, our bodies and our look remains infantile, so that we trigger feelings of nurturing and caregiving in other older individuals. This has a sort of a cultural parallel too. Scientifically, it might be elongated by evolution, but it's also in the social construction of childhood, it has been extended too. The medievalist Philip Arez said in his book, Centuries of Childhood, that pretty much before the 17th century, children are always represented as mini adults. And in medieval England, girls could marry as young as 12. And it was only really in the Victorian age, sort of in early modernity, that we invented the concept of childhood, and that childhood was elongated, and we thought young people had to be looked after till they were 18 or 20 or something, rather than just 12. So now Walt Disney, I guess, discovered a lot of this. He knew all this. He knew that he could use cuteness uh, to trigger feelings of attraction and care. And early Disney films, I'm showing you there, Snow White and Fantasia, start to use these principles, the bigger eyes, the clumsier movements, to inspire this feeling within us, this cute desire to look after. And Theodore Adorno called Disney the most dangerous man in America because he sort of knew this. He knew how to tap into this natural desire we have to nurture and take care of things. But what about cute in Japan? Well, Kawaii has a number of, there are a number of theories about what Kawaii is and where it came from. Some people can trace it right back to, or believe it can be traced right back to classics such as The Tale of Genji, where certain characters have pitiable qualities and therefore are inspiring other characters to look after them. Another set of theories says that there is in the switch from into the Edo period, the ideology of Neo-Confucianism changes the perception of women from being animalistic and therefore had to be tamed to being docile. So there's a change in the construction of gender that comes with Neo-Confucian ideology. Other theorists put it a little bit later into the Edo period, and they say things like the popularity of netsuke, tiny little ornaments for your obi, were some of the origins of cute. And some people think it is simply just a gender performance. I'm showing the idea of buriko, that when you are, or particularly when a woman suddenly puts on a young voice in the presence of a man. Kawaii doesn't always have to be translated as cute. You can also translate it, I guess, as able to be loved or lovable or adorable. In post-war Japan, animators, or the famous manga and anime artist Tezuka Osamu, started to use what Disney had pioneered and sort of take it to the next level. What Disney used in films like Bambi and Mickey Mouse, Tezuka Osamu was able to sort of take to the next level with some of his manga and then animation. Manga in particular was very popular in post-war Japan because the destruction of the bombing had left very few entertainments left, and manga was relatively cheap to produce. And it wasn't always, you didn't always buy it in the post-war period. There were kashihonya, which were sort of rental bookshops that sprung up at train stations in particular. And you could sort of rent a book of manga and read it on the train and then bring it back. So it became a very popular form of cheap entertainment in the post-war period. And I guess also on that point, there's an idea that part of its popularity and the popularity of cuteness in manga and anime was to deal with some of the post-war trauma. Tezuka was imitating Disney's version of Bavaria. Walt Disney sort of brought all these German fairy tales, which were perhaps themselves nostalgic of a more rural lifestyle. In Tezuka's case, though, his robot children and innocent sense of justice and what was right perhaps represented a demilitarized industry and was aimed at sort of erasing some of the war propaganda and trusting again in a childlike sense of what was right and wrong. This sort of explains, just on a little sidebar here, one of the questions that I'm often asked about Japanese manga and anime, which is why do Japanese draw themselves with big eyes, such big eyes? Because it wasn't always the case. I'm showing you there an image from the Edo period where it was thought to be beautiful and attractive to have very slim, small eyes, and to also present yourself as quite sophisticated. This woman is a courtesan, but she's also known for her sophistication, her worldliness. That was what was desirable at that point in time. Now, sort of it seems, or certainly in manga and anime, it's a very innocent, wide-eyed image is preferable. It's been posited that this is perhaps an empty signifier. You can project whatever you like on this sort of innocent wide-eyedness. So in terms of just manga that is drawn cuteness, it follows a certain development. In the 1970s, the Nijuyonen Gumi, the Year 24 group, sort of pioneered the yaoi genre, particularly beautiful boys, using some of the same sort of features, the big eyes, to sort of emphasize a cuteness. By the 1980s, manga started to become very, very mainstream and be used in textbooks. You can see there physics and calculus being taught through manga. And into the 2000s, there's this sort of moe manga, which was sort of taking some of these features into the extreme. The characters will sort of morph into different forms of cuteness depending on their mood. But I think there's still a difference between enjoying manga and anime, where there are cute characters, and then actually wanting to style yourself as an adult in a cute way yourself. And so this maybe has a different history that starts a little bit later. We can sort of trace manga and anime or its real acceleration or amplification to the post-war period, but self-styling and cuteness in fashion happens a little bit later. It doesn't really start until the 1970s, and one of the theories as to why was what was happening in the late 60s in Japan. In the late 60s, Japan was very different. It was a period of great social unrest and political violence. And you can see I'm showing you there images of the occupation of Tokyo University by students, and also things like the dramatic coup d'etat attempt and suicide by perhaps the most famous author at the time, Yukio Mishima, in 1970. So on both the left of politics and the right of politics, there was sort of a crisis in Japan. The crisis was sort of about the relationship between the university and the state, how much it could be controlled, but it also was sort of a proxy for resistance to patriarchal society, hierarchical social structures in general, the policy of acquiescence to the United States, any sort of resistance to the dominating logic of materialist capitalism as well. And at that time, sort of being an activist, being mature, having agency, resisting authority were all part of a youth identity. But in the immediate aftermath of this sort of period of great protest and suicide of famous people as sort of protest, there was this period that they call the shirake, the disillusioned calm. And this was not a period where anything had changed or been achieved. In fact, it was thought that the protest movements had actually failed to achieve any sort of real social change, and that there wasn't perhaps any alternative to the direction that Japan was taking. And it's been written that this was the moment when alternate social strategies started to be considered. And the first one is sort of very unexpected. In the very early and late 1960s and very early 1970s, students at school started to follow this fashion of writing in these sort of bubbly, cute characters. You can see here, I'm showing you examples of, they called it a maruichi, sort of rounded ways of writing Japanese. And there were variants of this, konekoji, like a cat, mangaji, burikoji. And this annoyed teachers no end. high seriousness around learning your characters, learning to write Japanese, was thought to be sort of symbolic of culture itself. So when students start not to take it seriously and sort of make it cute and perhaps effeminate or juvenile, they took sort of great offense at this. But it was perhaps the start of a new social strategy of refusing to take dominant social structures seriously. It's not we're resisting, we're just not taking it seriously. If you want to sort of read more about this very interesting beginning to perhaps young people adopting cuteness, you can read Sharon Kinsella's book, Schoolgirls, Money and Rebellion in Japan. Into the 1970s, though, there was sort of a commercialization of this phenomenon. Companies started to realize that cute was very, very popular and profitable, and particularly the Sanrio company made a discovery. Sanrio was a company that produces Hello Kitty, but they started out actually as a shoe company, and they used to make what we call in Australia thongs, but I think it's flip-flops, sort of plastic shoes that you would wear to the beach. And they found that if they put cute characters on them, they sold much better. And then Sanrio made the sort of very, perhaps at the time, risky move of stopping to produce shoes altogether and simply producing or creating cute characters. And so Sanrio became this company that would just produce sort of these cute images and cute images like Hello Kitty. Hello Kitty started in 1974. And very quickly, cuteness started to become the dominant aesthetic in Japan. And I'm showing sort of some extreme examples of this. In the top right is an example of all the police logos or mascots or cute characters across Japan. The Self-Defense Force, these are the organizations that have the monopoly of violence, are representing themselves in sort of these cute ways. And as I showed you before, even the driest of subjects, something like statistics, became teachable through cuteness, and something as boring as a road barrier still had to be infused with cuteness. Becomes sort of dominant aesthetic across Japan. So the question, I guess, then is why? Why was cuteness an appropriate form for Japan at these times? Well, one of the theories is that it was simply a rejection of masculine culture, dependence on the United States, dependence on big corporations, according to theorist Yuko Hasegawa, delayed any sense of mature identity. And so instead of, according to Yuko Hasegawa, instead of mature male identity and mature female identity, Japanese men would seek protection and were sort of insecure, and the type of woman that was desirable was sort of a mother figure or a passive girl. It's one possible theory. She also sort of says in culture there was a psychological unease in the 70s, and that led to a frivolous emptiness, utilization of cute and kitsch. Even an absence of meaning was desirable. Miwa Yanagi, the artist, sort of agrees. She says that was written that there was an emptiness, an absence of center that was becoming dominant in Japanese culture, and things like exaggerated politeness and overwrapping were part of this phenomenon. She's also linked it, interestingly, to Zen Buddhism, and she said that the emptiness of consumerism is maybe linked to the spiritual sense of emptiness which leads beyond the material world. So a nice sort of idea there. Another theorist, Mariko Mori, says that Japan had become overexposed to extreme styles and subcultures. And so the only possible response in this period was indifference, so not taking it seriously. And I guess cute is a way of, instead of resisting something head on, of sort of just refusing to take it seriously. So if we were going to sort of summarize this section in this idea of neoteny, Japan had a sort of a rejection of mature culture as undesirable. Maybe this was born from defeat in World War II, but it was reinforced by the absent father salaryman culture of overwork, subservience to the boss and the company, and social responsibility. And so the cultural expression of this was a desire to return to an idealized childhood, um, a period of sort of freedom before you had so many obligations, a free moment on the brink, perhaps, of sexual awakening, but certainly within a almost a liminal space between childhood and adulthood. So what about fashion? Well, this sort of matches up with this timeline as well. In 1973, we have brands such as Pink House is started. Pink House is still around today. I think it was sort of a brand that focuses on childlike clothing for young women. And it was actually started by former student activists from Waseda University. So you can see perhaps in this example, some students that were disillusioned by how far activism could take them and instead expressed their dissatisfaction through instead simply not taking the dominant culture that seriously. It wasn't just, of course, a feminine aesthetic. Very soon, becoming a cute boy became very desirable, and there were many magazines about that stressed not particularly a handsome or a macho or a sophisticated aesthetic, but again, a cute aesthetic. It's a way of sort of inspiring someone to look after you. You're cute, and so you attract people that think that or those emotions are triggered in you to look after them. Another sort of phenomenon that sort of matches this timeline and perhaps accelerated the aesthetic of cute, particularly within this area of self-styling and fashion, was idols. Idols perhaps came about through the great expansion of particularly color television. Happened around the Olympics and the royal wedding in the 60s. And you can see many of the most famous early idols debuted in the 70s or the 80s. Idols like Momoe Yamaguchi, the Candies, and Seiko Matsuda were all famous, not for being particularly beautiful or not for being particularly talented, but became famous because they were simply cute and cheerful. And I've got a note here on this slide just to sort of the provocation that the Japanese population actually peaks in 1975, and from 1975 it starts to decrease slowly at first, but then very rapidly. And so it's interesting that the worship of sort of youth and fertility peak at this moment when the population is also at its highest. Again, with idols, it's not simply a feminine phenomenon. There are many cute boy groups that style themselves not again by being particularly talented or being particularly musical or particularly handsome, but again, this sort of cuteness, accessibility. I'm showing you here SMAP, who was perhaps one of the biggest men's idol groups, were created by Johnny Kitagawa in what was called the Bidanchi Factory, the Pretty Man Factory, that just produced boy group after boy group after boy group. More recently, I guess, and in a amplification again of the utilization of cute, an idol group like AKB48, produced by Yasushi Akimoto, at their peak were one of the highest earning musical acts in the world. Dedicated theaters, daily performances. They sold themselves as, again, this accessibility, idols you could talk to. And what was sort of central, I guess, to their business model was the election of the most visible girls in the group, with 48 members, but you only really see the top 6 or so. The whole point of it is that you pick a girl and then you support them. And again, this mechanism of cuteness is central to that, wanting to care for and promote. Is very much part of their business model. Again, I've put there that their look was sexually suggestive, but not overly so, not quite on the level of K-pop. A friend of mine described it as virginal but willing. So it's sort of on the brink, perhaps, of sexual awakening is the look that they are going for. So idols from the very early 70s were young stars that became famous primarily because they were cute. And again, this idea that they were trying hard for you. They weren't particularly talented or beautiful, but they were dependent on you, their fan. And this, I think, became quite a successful business model. And one of the utilizations of this, as I mentioned before, was this AKB general election. And this is 1 year, 2014, when Mayu Watanabe was crowned the center. So the most visible girl, the girl that gets to dance in front of the 47 others. In this particular year, she garnered 159,854 votes out of 2.6 million votes cast across Japan. To vote cost you 1,524 yen. I'm not sure what that is in pounds, but probably $10, $12, I guess, to buy a single and then have voting rights in this election. So if you can sort of do the mathematics there, just of the votes, there was about $33 million US made, and that's before you sell the TV rights or the advertising or the stadium tickets. So it became a very successful way of making money out of idol groups when perhaps you were no longer making money from selling CDs or the music itself. So I guess this is actually where it differs quite markedly from K-pop, which is all about a sort of a perfection and is monetized through advertising and television. But J-pop also uses, of course, television and commercialization, but the look had to be quite different, quite imperfect to sort of inspire this desire for people to vote for their favorite members. Just while I'm talking about business models, Morinosuke Kawaguchi, who was sort of involved in the Cool Japan project, wrote a book called Geeky Girl Innovation, a Japanese subculturalist's guide to technology and design. And he had a couple of interesting ideas here. He sort of first thought that cuteness was a design opportunity. And you can see he's tried to illustrate this through cars, where he says that French and Italian cars often have a sort of an adult feminine aesthetic to them, a sort of Italian Ferraris, I think, and Citroens and things like that were sort of adult feminine in their look, whereas Mercedes and Volvos were sort of an adult masculine aesthetic from Northern Europe. The Americans were sort of a juvenile masculine aesthetic, their Hummers and their muscle cars. Yankee glamorous, he sort of called it. But Japan sort of had this niche in that it was juvenile feminine in look. And so the Honda Civics and the Toyota Priuses were cute. And that was perhaps the opportunity for Japanese design. He also sort of shows this progression of protagonists in popular culture from it being an adult male to being a young male, and then sort of into the 90s and whatever, the protagonist in a lot of stories became a young girl. So what about sort of bodies and fashion in terms of cuteness? Well, in the 1990s, there was a famous nightclub called Juliana's. Actually, it appeared just after the bubble. People often think it was a part of the bubble economy, the decadence and the of this famous nightclub. But it actually started a little bit after the bubble era, and a lot of the culture of the bubble era continues on even when the economic bubble has started to burst. What Juliana's was famous for was bodycon. That's uh, having a long, skinny body. And if you sort of were elongated in this way, sort of like a model, you got to dance on the podium at Juliana's. That was sort of became symbolic of the age. However, most Japanese girls are not super tall, and so magazines started to promote a different aesthetic, and it was an interesting alternative form of beauty, and that was sort of obviously cuteness. Magazines that were either started and emphasized cuteness, or changed their look to emphasize cuteness, started to appear at this time. So it was a way of creating an alternative attractiveness. It wasn't sort of overtly sexy. It was doing this other cute thing that was also perhaps equally appealing. And again, there was this alternative to standards of masculinity. If you didn't want to be the sort of suited salary man that fell asleep on the train, or you weren't super macho or whatever, there was also an alternative form of self-styling. You could be cute. And so young people become popular by their apparent weakness, dependence, and inability rather than through strength and ability. And it's been suggested that this is actually sort of a form of Japanese humility. It's not polite to sort of, or it is polite to sort of depend on others and inspire others to depend on you. So I guess we could say that in Japanese culture, throughout the latter part of the 20th century, there's a general undesirability of adulthood. And whereas Walt Disney romanticized a pre-industrial, pre-capitalist form of social relations and a rural society, what cuteness emphasizes and romanticizes is a sentimental journey back to an idealized childhood, both emotions and mental state. Because in Japan, adulthood is all about restrictions, it's about hard work, responsibility, obligation, and has little freedom. And perhaps this is even more acute for women who are freer than men in this period of youth. In youth, they're sort of excluded from traditional systems, and unhampered, they can pursue individual fulfillment, decadence, consumption, and play before marriage and maturity ends those privileges. So we could say then that maybe cuteness, kawaii, is an act of resistance against some of these established values. I did want to sort of show you an example of cute fashion. Kogal, or kyogalu, is a contraction that means high school girl. It was originally the code that disco bouncers used to distinguish adults from minors, but it was adopted by the girls themselves. And it was first recorded in the media around 1972, but into the sort of 80s and 90s, it became much more popular. The center for Kogal fashion was, of course, Shibuya and Harajuku, and the real mecca itself was the 109 building in the center of Shibuya. Couple of the sort of most famous pop stars of the 90s both sort of had different versions of a cute aesthetic, Namie Amuro and Ayumi Hamasaki. I'm sort of showing you this too because part of this culture, the Kogal culture, was print club, Purikura. Purikura was first introduced in the mid-90s into games arcades. And basically it was a photo booth, but it was a photo booth where you could go in and slightly change your appearance, maybe write cute messages, record a social interaction with your friend. And sort of remember, this is before we had omnipresent mobile phones and selfies and Instagram. This was a culture of self-scrutiny and display that started to appear in Japan and emphasized a cute aesthetic. You could go into these booths and make yourself cuter, make your eyes bigger, etc., etc. This is another form of sort of late 90s cute fashion that I wanted to show you. This is from the Fruits magazine that ran from 1997 to 2017 and emphasized a sort of a decora fashion, bright colors, excessive accessories, and again, quite a different form of cute, but cute nonetheless. It also had a culture of display. People would often dress up and then go to areas in Harajuku wanting to be would add an interesting Gothic element. And so a lot of artists sort of play on cuteness. Maybe one of the most famous, Yoshitomo Nara, often uses or cute characters, but there's often a sort of a punk or rebellious aspect to it, making you perhaps question the cuteness. Takashi Murakami, the probably most successful contemporary artist in Japan, is responsible for sort of some of the Louis Vuitton collaborations that take the sort of high seriousness of the Louis Vuitton motifs and give them cute bubblegum colors. And some of his super flat art uses this sort of cute lack of sophistication as something that then becomes aesthetically appealing. This is, I just wanted to show you also Miwa Yanagi, the artist, the photographer, often uses cute or the homogenizing aspects of cute in her photographs about women and commenting on womanhood in Japanese culture. So prevalent, in fact, was cuteness in Japanese contemporary art that there was a show in 2011 at the Japan Society in New York that was called Bye Bye Kitty, and it was supposed to mark the end of the dominance of the cute aesthetic. But of course, it didn't. So what can we say then are the politics of cute? Is it empowering for people, women, men, etc., or is it immature? Is it something that elongates or has negative social effects? So it has been theorized that kawaii performs a political function of undermining current ideologies of gender and power. It's sort of one of the arguments that I've run today. An alternate argument that's also popular is that kawaii is antisocial because it idealizes the pre-social and shrinks from political duties. A lot of conservative critics say that cuteness and kawaii has created a feminized society where decadent young women do whatever they want and make unreasonable demands while also not having children. So this sort of cuteness is a way of a selfish retreat into your own childhood rather than having children yourself. It's yeah, I tend to agree with the former rather than the latter. Another set of theories emphasize that cuteness is a way of repersonalizing a lot of things that capitalist industrial production has depersonalized. So I'm showing you there a contact lens case that would just be an inanimate, boring plastic object that you might keep in your purse or whatever, but has been given some sort of personality and character by having Hello Kitty as one of the containers. And so this is an interesting theory that maybe cuteness disguises and compensates for any alienation of individuals from society. but also we might say that cuteness loans personality and subjectivity to otherwise meaningless goods. It's a form, I guess, then of anthropomorphism. That is, we are projecting on it our own feelings, the same as we might do for pets. And perhaps this is an extension, therefore, of having pets. Cute is replacing genuine feelings of nurture with artificial ones. So, some conclusions. Value judgments in fashion are culturally specific, of course. And maybe we can say, from what I've told you today, that cute in Japan started as something political, a way of rejecting the seriousness of some things that were important in Japanese culture. It has become, however, an encompassing aesthetic. And I think it's lost any particular meaning. I mean, it's just sort of, as I said, with those friends of mine from when I was at university, it's just become the norm. It's become the background, one of the background aesthetics. And I guess I wanted to leave you with a thought too. Often when I asked my students in Japan, I've shown them that cute in both manga and anime and cuteness in self-styling, in fashion, started at a certain point. And I asked them whether they think it will last forever. And they always say yes. They couldn't imagine a world in which kawaii was not something desirable and something that all young people wanted to be. But fashions always have a beginning and they always have an end. And I guess it's an interesting question, what sort of social changes would be required for cuteness to no longer be the dominant or one of the dominant self-styling aesthetics in Japan. Thank you very much. I've got some books if you're interested to read any more on any of these topics. This is my own book, Introducing Japanese Popular Culture, from 2018. I mentioned earlier Sharon Kinsella's Schoolgirls, Money and Rebellion in Japan from 2013, and Morinosuke Kawaguchi's book, Geeky Girl Innovation from 2012. And I guess if you're after something a little bit more theoretical, Theodore Adorno's The Cultural Industry, where he sort of talks about enlightenment and mass deception from 1944, would be a good one to think more about this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Toby. That was fascinating lecture. From my point of view, that the idea of kawaii has been existed all my life, too naturally in my life. So it was very interesting to learn in your lecture today that the aesthetic of cuteness, kawaii, contains so many connotations. And I just can't imagine a society of Japan without the idea of kawaii. So I really don't want kawaii culture would end. So kawaii, I hope kawaii would be the eternity thing, but yeah. So let's see the questions. Okay, so we've got some questions here. So can we review this together? Okay, so this is the from the one student. So I am going to read this. How does cuteness kawaii flow and transform across different manga, shoujo and traditional styles? What unexpected connections and creative energies emerge when we see cuteness not as a fixed thing, but as a living, changing experience that reshapes how we see and feel through graphic storytelling?
Gosh, that's a very interesting question. How does kawaii flow and transform across different manga? I guess there was the slide I showed you before of the sort of initial uses of it by Tezuka Osamu, and then when it was used mainly for child characters, and then as it became or it sort of flows across and becomes acceptable for it to be in representations of boys, representations of older women, etc. Yeah, I think that there is sort of a possibility and um, a an openness about childhood, and I think that's really what was the initial appeal. Um, it creates the creative energy is that from a child's perspective, anything's possible. And it's before, I guess, a lot of those sort of obligations and fixed structures in Japanese society. It really is cuteness is a place of genuine play. So I guess that's the creative energy that emerges with cuteness. Um, yes, a living, changing experience that changes how we see and feel graphic storytelling. Um, yeah, I guess it isn't a fixed thing. It's an aesthetic that evolves and changes and became much more mainstream, and perhaps lost some of its initial meanings along the way. Um, yeah, it's a great question. Thank you.
Thank you, Toby. Okay, so let's move on to the next question from Michi. Uh, how does kawaii aesthetics in manga neutralize artistic critique by converting potential resistance into a standardized, marketable cuteness that obscures systemic social tensions?
Well, I think that it almost answers itself. It does sort of neutralize an artistic critique, but because it does convert potential resistance into a marketable cuteness, it obscures and hides systematic social tensions. I think that's a spot on comment about the way Kawaii works. It sort of refuses to um, accept or take seriously, um, as you said, social tension or um, or the frame in which we understand potential resistance. I guess there's, it's a little bit like the aesthetic of cool, where the aesthetic of cool is also sort of a not taking things seriously or not pretending or genuinely not caring about what's going on. If you're cool, you don't care about um, uh, whatever the structure is. And so I guess these are social strategies, and uh, it's part of, I guess, the way youth is able to rebel and change adult dynamics.
Okay, thank you very much, Tony. So let's move on to, we've got a few more questions. So let's move on to the next one from Christina. To what extent is kawaii considered desirable by the male population? Is it considered something to be adopted by men to appeal to the female population? Or is it something that is considered to be intrinsically beneficial to them?
I thought particularly by the younger male population, it was incredibly desirable. It was just with women, it was one of the dominant ways of self-styling. Um, Girls loved cute boys. It was a different sort of attraction to than being attracted to macho or sportiness or anything like that. Um, and then there was sort of more, this is from sort of my time in Japan, um, uh, sort of the passiveness of cuteness was being emphasized as well. There was the phenomenon of short uh, shosoku keidanshi, like the shosoku keidanshi, the vegetarian boys.
Social dance, isn't it?
Shosoku
Yeah,
shoku.
really difficult to say
Yeah. I haven't said that word for years. But yes, it's sort of this idea that these were boys that were not interested in aggressively pursuing girls. But then this became something that girls wanted because they thought a boy like that would be nice because then he wouldn't be chasing other girls. He'd be loyal and and so this then became sort of another sort of game where there was There were boys that perhaps were not so passive, that were pretending to be passive. And so I think, yeah, it's something very desirable. And one of the first things you notice living in Japan is this whole different way that self-styling tries to appeal to other people.
Thank you, Tony. We've got one more question from Andres. As Kewpie mayonnaise teaches us, shouldn't we start looking at the Kawaii phenomenon quite a number before the 1970s?
Absolutely. I think in there is cuteness in post-war manga and anime, and then even in some of the earliest comics imported from the United States, we see that. In terms of, I guess, what you're getting at there in terms of graphic design, uh, yes, there's sort of we could probably find examples of cuteness in graphic design in the early 20th century, but perhaps more by accident than by a sort of a scheme that graphic designers start to understand and utilize. I really think it's Disney that becomes so famous because it's sort of that's the way he does his animation, and then the Japanese animators that then imitate it and then take it in whole different directions in the Disney sort of 1930s, and then Japanese manga anime sort of into the 40s and 50s. Yeah. I think you've got your microphone off.
Yes, thank you. So, Toby, thank you. I've got a question from me. Is that okay to ask you here?
Sure.
You know, you are talking about the company called Sanrio, the Kitty-chan's company.
Mm.
They regularly speaks about peace and love through their social media and newsletters. That's what I found the other day. For example, Hello Kitty's official account supported Black Lives Matter, and Sanrio has shared anti-war messages through the message from Strawberry King, and through kawaii characters like Hello Kitty. And Sanrio company continues to promote peace. Do you see any common fundamental message or values between this commercial kawaii culture and the political and social meanings of kawaii in fashion that you research?
Uh, that's a yeah, that's a fascinating question. I guess it's a dominant Japanese ideology too to be accepting, and whenever you pose for a photograph, you peace, right? It's an image that's always there. Peace is um, uh, so yes, I think that it is sort of it's cute, but it is also a political message. There is a political message there of peacefulness and um, inclusion and fairness, and it is sort of that idea that a childish morality is purer sometimes than an adult morality. As adults, we have all sorts of ideologies and things in our minds, but children know right from wrong immediately. It's instinctual, and I think that's something that cute aspires to, a sense of justice and what's right and wrong.
Yeah, oh, that's pretty fascinating. So you use the example of this peace sign. So
Mm,
if you flip over, it's going to have a different message. That's kind of
mm,
similar thing, isn't it?
yeah.
Interesting. I guess. Yes, thank you so much, Toby. I want to ask you more questions, but we haven't got enough time. So let me share my slide again. Where is it? Here you go. So thank you, Toby, for coming to the webinar today. And we need to say goodbye and now. And thank you very much for the audience. We would be very grateful if you could complete the short survey to tell us how you found this lecture and the event. And the survey will be automatically sent to you later. So if you could write us, if you could answer that, I'll be so happy. Thank you so much. And then also you can watch all the recordings from the previous Cardiff Japanese webinar series. So you've got the this QR code here, so you can take a shot and then you can enjoy the YouTube channel later. So yes, thank you so much, Toby.
Thank you. Thank you.
So yes, I am going to stop sharing. I want to see your face. So